I'm not flying that route. The second pilot pushed the weather printout across the operations desk and tapped the wind forecast with one finger. Not with that runway, that front moving in, and no reliable ground support after dark. Caleb Mercer didn't argue. That was what caught Maren Caldwell's attention. Outside the windows of the small charter terminal in Burlington, Vermont, late October, clouds hung low over the mountains. Wet leaves skittered across the ramp while ground crews worked in insulated jackets beneath the hard northwest wind. Maren sat several feet from the desk in her wheelchair, a charcoal wool coat buttoned over a burgundy sweater. She had already heard no twice that morning. She wasn't angry about the weather. She was angry about being discussed like freight. One operator had spent 10 minutes explaining the complications of transporting her wheelchair without once asking her how she normally traveled. Caleb had noticed. He was 41, broad-shouldered, with short brown hair, light stubble, and the permanently tired eyes of a man who had packed a school lunch before sunrise. His dark flight jacket looked used rather than stylish. His phone buzzed. A message from his 11-year-old daughter, Lucy. Wilderness program forms due Friday. 3 exclamation points. Caleb stared at the message. Lucy had been asking for 2 weeks. He had been avoiding an answer for 2 weeks. For years of raising her alone had taught him to anticipate problems before they arrived. Bad roads, late buses, unreliable adults, trips into the mountains with teachers he barely knew. He typed, "We'll talk tonight," then put the phone away. "Before we go further, how old are you? Where are you watching from? And have you ever had fear make a decision before you realized it?" Across the room, Maren ended another call. "So that's it?" she asked the dispatcher. "I'm sorry, Ms. Caldwell. I need to be in northern Maine before tomorrow morning. The weather isn't cooperating." Caleb finally looked at the paperwork. Destination runway. Crosswind. Fuel requirements. Alternates. He knew why the pilots had refused. And he agreed with them. Maren noticed him reading. "You have an opinion? I wouldn't fly that plan either." Her expression cooled. "Then we agree. About that plan." Caleb pulled the chart closer. He had spent years flying corporate turboprops before stepping away from regular charter work after his wife died. These days he coordinated operations, covered relief flights, and kept his ratings and currency current because some part of him had never been able to completely leave the cockpit. He traced a different route, earlier departure, different fuel stop, a better alternate with confirmed ground services. The dispatcher leaned over. "That adds time." "It adds options," Caleb said. Maren rolled closer. "Are you saying this can be done?" Caleb studied the weather one more time. "Safely? Maybe. If the numbers stay where they are." "And who flies it?" Caleb looked through the window toward the aircraft waiting on the wet ramp. For years, he had built his life around reducing uncertainty. Now uncertainty was sitting directly in front of him. He picked up the flight plan. "I do." Caleb didn't head for the airplane after saying yes. He headed for the phone. For the next 20 minutes, he rebuilt the trip one piece at a time. He called the fuel stop, confirmed the alternate airport's operating hours, checked ground transportation, reviewed the latest weather, then ran the numbers again. Maren watched from beside the operations desk. "You always this cautious?" she asked. "Yes." That sounded almost proud. "It keeps airplanes boring." A faint smile crossed her face. "I'm starting to understand why you're still alive." Caleb glanced at her. "That's the goal." The dispatcher returned with updated weather. The cold front was still moving east, but Caleb's earlier departure gave them a reasonable window. Not a guarantee, a window. He accepted that distinction. Before signing the paperwork, he stepped into the hallway and called his older sister, Rachel. "Can Lucy stay with you tonight?" "She already asked me if she could." Caleb frowned. "She did." Rachel laughed. "Your daughter plans ahead. Wonder where she got that." He explained that he might be gone overnight. Rachel agreed immediately. Then Lucy came on the phone. "You're flying." "One trip." There was a pause. "You said flying was too unpredictable." Caleb looked through the terminal window at the gray sky. "I said a lot of things." "Does this mean I can do the wilderness program?" "Nice try. We'll talk when I'm home." Lucy groaned. "That means no." "It means we'll talk." "It always means no." The line went quiet before she handed the phone back to Rachel. That sentence stayed with him. Outside, the wind smelled like wet pavement and fallen leaves. At the aircraft, Maren stopped beside the cabin door. Her wheelchair had to be secured for the flight, and the ground employee approached as if following a familiar routine. Caleb raised a hand. Hold on. He looked at Maren instead. Tell us how you want to do this. The ground employee hesitated. Maren studied Caleb for a moment. Then she explained exactly where she needed the transfer chair positioned, which part of her wheelchair could be removed, and what should never be lifted by the armrests. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody called her brave. They simply listened. Once she was settled inside, Caleb personally checked the wheelchair restraints and cargo placement before climbing forward. Maren watched him enter the cockpit. You really used to do this full time? Corporate turboprops. Mostly northeast routes. Used to. Caleb fastened his harness. After my wife died, Lucy was 7. Charter schedules stopped making sense. You quit. I changed jobs. There was a difference in the way he said it. Maren heard it. You miss flying? Caleb switched on the avionics. I miss knowing exactly what my job is. That sounds like a yes. He didn't answer. Minutes later, the engines came alive, their vibration moving through the cabin. Caleb completed the checklist without rushing. Maren looked through the window at Burlington disappearing beneath a ceiling of dark October clouds. Once they leveled off, she spoke through the headset. Can I ask you something? You just did. She smiled. Why take this flight if you built your whole life around being home? Caleb kept his eyes forward. Because being careful doesn't mean saying no to everything. Maren looked toward the cockpit. That sounds like something you're trying to convince yourself of. For the first time that morning, Caleb had no quick answer. Ahead of them, the sky over northern New England was still open. For now, for the first 40 minutes, the flight was almost disappointingly ordinary. Caleb preferred it that way. The turboprop moved above a broken layer of gray clouds while patches of red and gold forest appeared through openings below. He monitored the instruments, checked the latest weather, and listened to air traffic control without wasting movement. Maren watched him from the cabin. You weren't kidding about making flying boring. Boring gets people home. That your professional philosophy? Pretty much. Or your personal one? Caleb glanced back. Maren was smiling, but the question wasn't a joke. He returned his attention to the instruments. You ask a lot of questions. I run a company. Questions are cheaper than mistakes. Caleb couldn't argue with that. A few minutes passed before Maren spoke again. What's the wilderness program? Caleb's hand paused near the radio. You heard that. Small airplane. He exhaled. Lucy's school takes 6th graders into the Green Mountains for 3 days. Hiking, cabins, outdoor skills. And she wants to go. Desperately. But you don't. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Caleb checked the engine gauges. My wife died 4 years ago. After that, I learned there's a difference between what probably won't happen and what can't happen. Maren's expression softened, but she didn't offer sympathy he hadn't asked for. Instead, she said, there's also a difference between protecting someone and making their world smaller. That landed harder. Caleb looked back. You speaking from experience? Constantly. She adjusted the blanket over her legs. After my accident, people became very interested in telling me what was reasonable, which buildings were too difficult, which trips were too complicated, which meetings could happen without me. That's not the same as an 11-year-old in the mountains. No, it isn't. Her answer surprised him. I'm not saying Lucy should go, Maren continued. I'm saying fear gets very convincing when it learns professional vocabulary. Caleb almost smiled. Risk assessment is professional vocabulary. So is avoidance. Before he could answer, the radio came alive. Caleb listened. His expression changed. Maren noticed immediately. What? Destination weather update. He wrote down the numbers. The front was moving faster than forecast. Ceiling dropping. Crosswind increasing. Still manageable for the moment. But the margin was shrinking. Caleb contacted operations for the latest conditions at their planned fuel stop and alternate. Maren stayed quiet while he worked. 5 minutes later, Caleb changed heading slightly. Problem? She asked. Not yet. That sounds carefully chosen. It is. He explained that they would continue toward the fuel stop, reassess there, and abandon the destination if conditions crossed the limits he had set before departure. Maren nodded. No argument. You came all this way for tomorrow. I came all this way to get there. Not to die proving I could. Caleb looked at her again. For someone he had assumed would push against every limitation, she sounded remarkably clear about one. His phone, switched to airplane mode, sat beside his flight bag. He thought about Lucy. About 3 days in the mountains. About all the things that could go wrong. Then the radio crackled again. This time the message was about their alternate. Caleb reached for his chart. The easy part of the flight was over. Caleb listened to the transmission twice before answering. The alternate airport they had planned to use was temporarily restricting arrivals. An aircraft had developed a mechanical problem after landing, and the main runway was partially blocked while crews dealt with it. Nothing catastrophic had happened. But for Caleb, the important fact was simpler. Their backup plan was no longer a reliable backup. He acknowledged the controller, then unfolded the chart across his lap. Maren watched him from behind. So not yet just became something? It became a change. That sounds like pilot language for yes. Caleb pointed to another airport farther east. We have options. Destination weather is getting worse, so I'm taking that off the table. There's another regional field here. You've flown there? Twice. Runway. Long enough. Weather is better. Fuel is fine. Maren waited. And? Caleb glanced back. And what? Can I get off the airplane? The question stopped him. He had checked runway length, approach procedures, fuel availability, operating hours, and weather. He had not checked whether the airport could safely accommodate Maren's transfer from the aircraft after hours. I don't know yet. Maren nodded slowly. Caleb expected frustration. Instead, she said, then we don't know if it's an alternate. He almost corrected her. From an aviation standpoint, it was. From her standpoint, an airport where she could land but not leave the aircraft was something else entirely. Caleb contacted operations. The answer took several minutes. The terminal would still be open when they arrived, but nobody could confirm whether appropriate transfer equipment would be available. The regular ground service supervisor had already left for the day. Caleb rubbed his jaw. Outside, the clouds had thickened into a nearly solid gray layer. Maren looked through the window. I've spent nights in airports before. I'm not planning on making you spend one inside my airplane. You may not get to control that. Caleb turned toward her. I control where this airplane goes. Exactly. There was no anger in her voice. That made the point sharper. You're solving the problem you know how to solve, she continued. Keeping the aircraft safe. You should. But landing isn't the end of the trip for me. Caleb looked down at the chart again. For years, he had trusted preparation because preparation made uncertainty smaller. Now every answer seemed to create another question. He scanned the nearby airports. One name caught Maren's eye. Wait. Caleb looked back. She leaned forward. That municipal airport. What's the identifier? He gave it to her. Maren's expression changed. Not fear. Recognition. I know that place. How? My company evaluated its accessibility retrofit 2 years ago. Caleb stared at her. Maren pointed toward the chart. And if they kept the equipment we recommended, that airport may solve a problem your flight manual can't. What was the airport called? Caleb asked. Maren gave him the name. He found it on the chart, then immediately began checking what mattered to him. Runway length, elevation, approaches, fuel availability, reported winds. Runway's shorter, he said. Too short. No. Just means I don't get lazy. Maren pulled out her phone. They still had intermittent connectivity at altitude. My company worked with the county on an accessibility assessment there 2 years ago. They were replacing an old boarding ramp with a portable lift system. 2 years is a long time. I know. Caleb appreciated the answer. She wasn't asking him to trust a memory because she was the CEO. She was giving him something to verify. Maren searched through old contacts while Caleb called operations and requested current airport information. A few minutes later, she found a number. Daniel Price, County Facilities Manager. You know him? I argued with him for 6 months. Caleb glanced back. Friendly argument? He stopped answering my calls for a week. So close friends. Maren laughed, then dialed. The first call went unanswered. So did the second. Caleb continued flying. He refused to let the possibility of better ground support turn into a decision before it became a fact. Operations came back first. The airport was open. Weather was currently better than at their original destination, though winds were expected to increase later. Fuel was available through a self-service system. Accessibility equipment could not be confirmed. Not enough, Caleb said. Maren nodded. Agreed. Her phone rang. Daniel Price. She answered immediately. Within minutes, her tone shifted from casual to precise. Is the portable lift still operational? Good. Who has access after hours? Can someone meet an arriving aircraft? She listened. Then she looked toward Caleb. Yes, I'm the passenger. Another pause. No, I don't need an ambulance. I need the lift. Caleb smiled despite himself. When she ended the call, she said, "Lift works. Facility staff can have someone there. Accessible van service needs about 45 minutes notice." Caleb wrote everything down. Then he verified the contact through operations before changing course. Maren noticed. "You checked me." "I checked the information." "Good." There was no offense in her voice. That surprised him more than it should have. Caleb contacted air traffic control and requested the diversion. Once it was approved, he turned the aircraft northeast. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Maren said, "The other airport looked perfect to you. From the cockpit. And this one looked useful to me. From a wheelchair. Different checklists." Caleb nodded. That was exactly it. He had spent most of his adult life believing competence meant knowing what to do before anyone had to tell him. Flying rewarded that instinct. Fatherhood had made it stronger. When Lucy was sick, he handled it. When school called, he handled it. When his wife died, and there was suddenly nobody standing beside him to make decisions, he handled everything because there was no other choice. Somewhere along the way, handling everything had become the same thing as being responsible. Maren broke the silence. "You know what people usually do when they find out I use a wheelchair?" "What?" "They either assume I need help with everything, or they become so determined not to offend me that they stop offering help at all. Which do you prefer?" "Neither." Caleb looked back. "I prefer people asking." The answer stayed with him. A patch of turbulence shook the cabin gently. Caleb checked the weather display. The front was still moving. Their new airport was workable, but the margin he liked was beginning to narrow. Then his phone briefly regained service. A message downloaded from Lucy. "I got accepted." Under it was a photograph of the Wilderness Program letter. Caleb stared at his daughter's grin. Another message followed. "Please don't say no before you read it." His thumb rested against the screen. Maren could see enough from behind him to understand. "You don't have to answer now," she said. "I know." But Caleb realized something uncomfortable. Lucy wasn't asking him to guarantee that nothing bad could happen. She was asking him not to decide her future before he had even examined the options. Caleb locked the phone and returned his attention to the instruments. Ahead, the clouds were getting darker. For the first time that day, however, the problem no longer felt like his alone to solve. The first thing Caleb saw was the wind. Not the runway, not the terminal, the windsock. It stood nearly straight as the airport came into view beneath the broken clouds. Caleb listened to the automated weather report again, then compared it with the limits he had established before changing course. The numbers were still acceptable. Barely. Maren heard his voice become shorter and more deliberate as he spoke with the controller. "Getting worse?" she asked. "Getting closer to my limit." "Same thing." "No." Caleb began preparing for the approach. Below them, late October forests covered the hills in dark reds, browns, and fading orange. The municipal airport appeared between two wooded ridges, its runway darkened by recent rain. Maren tightened her seatbelt. "Tell me what you need from me." Caleb almost said, "Nothing." The word reached the back of his throat and stopped. "Instead," he said, "once we land, I need you to confirm the ground crew has the right equipment before anyone starts moving your chair." "Done. And if something isn't right, I say something. Immediately." "You really like that word." "Today I do." Maren smiled. Then the airplane descended into rougher air. The cabin shook. Caleb's hands remained steady on the controls, but his attention sharpened. Wind correction, airspeed, runway alignment. He wasn't trying to prove anything. That mattered. Years earlier, Caleb might have treated a difficult approach as a test of skill. Fatherhood had changed that. Losing his wife had changed it more. Now he understood that experience wasn't knowing how much danger you could handle. It was knowing when you didn't need to handle it at all. The runway grew larger in the windshield. The aircraft drifted. Caleb corrected. Another gust pushed harder. He checked the instruments. Still stable. For several seconds. Then it wasn't. The approach began moving outside the conditions he had promised himself he would accept. The runway was right there. Close enough to tempt him. Maren could see it through the front windshield. "We're almost down," she said. Caleb advanced the power. "No." The engines responded immediately. The airplane stopped descending. Maren felt herself pressed gently into the seat as Caleb initiated the go-around. The runway slipped beneath them. For one startled second, she said nothing. "Then what happened?" "Approach wasn't stable." "Could you have landed?" Caleb climbed away from the airport. Maybe. Maren waited. That isn't an answer. It's the only one that matters. He contacted the controller, reported the go-around, and requested another approach after repositioning. No embarrassment. No dramatic speech. Just procedure. Maren looked out at the runway disappearing behind them. I thought taking control meant making the landing. Caleb adjusted their heading. Taking control means being willing not to. The sentence surprised even him. His phone was tucked away, but Lucy's message returned to his mind. Please don't say no before you read it. Caleb had spent 4 years believing safety meant removing uncertainty before moving forward. Yet here he was, circling above a wet runway, doing something different. He wasn't pretending the risk had disappeared. He was choosing what risk was acceptable, setting a boundary, and refusing to cross it. On the second approach, the wind eased slightly. Caleb lined up again. Behind him, Maren watched quietly. This time, neither of them needed the other to promise everything would be fine. They only needed each other to do the next thing well. The second approach felt different before Caleb even turned toward the runway. The wind was still there. The pavement was still wet. Nothing had magically become safe. But now Caleb had something he hadn't had 5 minutes earlier, a clear decision already made. If the approach crossed his limits again, he would leave. No hesitation. No argument with himself. Ground crew just texted, Maren said from behind him. Lift is outside the terminal. Van is 10 minutes away. Good. Anything else? Stay exactly where you are until I tell you otherwise. I'm excellent at sitting. Caleb laughed once. The tension in his shoulders loosened. Just enough. He completed the landing checklist. The runway appeared ahead. This time the aircraft settled onto the approach with less drift. Caleb made small corrections rather than chasing every movement. Airspeed held. Alignment held. A gust hit them 50 feet above the pavement. Caleb corrected. The wheels touched down firmly. Not beautifully. Safely. He reduced power and guided the aircraft toward the taxiway. Maren released a breath. That was less dramatic than I expected. Best compliment you could give me. By the time they reached the small terminal, daylight was fading behind the hills. Caleb shut down the engines. For a moment, the cabin became completely quiet. Then Maren looked through the window. 2 airport employees waited beside a portable lift. An accessible van stood behind them. She smiled. Different checklist. Caleb nodded. Same destination. Not quite. She was right. They were still more than an hour from where she had originally intended to go, and the worsening weather meant her morning schedule would have to change. Yet she didn't reach immediately for her phone to demand that someone fix it. Instead, she called her assistant. Move tomorrow's meeting to 10:30, she said. Remote attendance for the first session. Caleb glanced toward her. Maren noticed. What? I thought getting there tonight was non-negotiable. So did I. What changed? She looked toward the wet runway. I did. The ground crew opened the cabin door. Before anyone touched the wheelchair, Maren checked the lift herself and gave instructions. Caleb stayed nearby, but didn't take over. When the transfer was complete, she settled into her chair and pulled her charcoal coat tighter against the cold wind. Caleb stepped onto the ramp. His phone connected to the airport Wi-Fi. 3 messages from Lucy appeared. The last one was simple. Did you read the program information yet? Caleb opened the attachment. For once, he actually read it. Certified guides. Emergency communication equipment. Medical forms. Weather procedures. A detailed itinerary. Adult-to-student ratios. It wasn't risk-free. Nothing was. Maren rolled beside him. Bad news. No, he kept reading. That may be the problem. She waited. Caleb reached the final page. A parent's signature line. For 4 years, every decision about Lucy had passed through one question. What could go wrong? Standing beside an airplane he had just refused to land until the conditions were right, Caleb realized he had been asking only half the question. The other half was, what could she lose if I never let her try? He called Lucy. She answered on the first ring. Dad, I read it. Silence. All of it. All of it. And Caleb looked across the ramp toward the windsock still moving in the autumn air. We're going to talk about what you need to do to go safely. Another silence. Then Lucy's voice changed. You mean I can go? I mean I'm not saying no just because I'm scared. Maren turned away slightly, giving him privacy. Lucy laughed on the other end. Caleb closed his eyes. For the first time in years, uncertainty didn't feel like something he had failed to eliminate. It felt like something he could finally learn to live beside. By the time Caleb finished his call with Lucy, Maren was already dealing with the next problem. "The accessible van can get me to a hotel," she said, looking at her phone. "But not all the way to the demonstration site tonight. Roads farther north are getting worse." Caleb slipped his phone into his jacket. "You could try in the morning." "I could." There was no frustration in her voice this time. They moved inside the small terminal, where fluorescent lights reflected off rain-darkened windows. Maren removed her charcoal wool coat, but kept the burgundy sweater on. Caleb carried his flight bag, his dark jacket still damp from the ramp. A facilities employee approached. "Miss Caldwell, we can have the van ready in 5 minutes." "Thank you." The man looked at Caleb. "Hell of a flight today." Caleb shook his head. "Just a flight." Maren raised an eyebrow after the employee walked away. "That modesty thing real?" "Mostly exhaustion." She laughed. They stopped near a row of plastic chairs overlooking the runway. For the first time since Burlington, neither had somewhere immediate to be. Maren opened her laptop. "What are you doing?" "Changing tomorrow." "You already moved the meeting." "I moved the time. Now I'm changing how we do it." Her engineering team could run the physical demonstration without her. Maren would join remotely from the hotel, answer questions, and let the engineers who had built the prototype lead the room. Caleb leaned against the window. "That bother you?" "Yes." He appreciated the honesty. "I spent years fighting to be physically present," she said. "After my accident, every time I couldn't get into a building or onto a stage, somebody suggested I join remotely. Eventually, I started hearing remote as another way of saying I didn't belong there." Caleb understood more than she probably realized. "So tomorrow feels like giving in." It did. "And now?" Maren closed the laptop. "Now I think there's a difference between someone else deciding what I can't do and me deciding what isn't worth forcing." Outside, the wind pushed rain across the glass. Caleb thought about the first approach. The runway had been directly in front of him. He could have tried to force that too. Maren looked at him. "What did Lucy say?" "She thinks I said yes." "Did you?" "I said we'd figure out how she could go safely." "That sounds suspiciously like yes." Caleb smiled. "She's 11. Apparently she has legal counsel now." Maren laughed, then became thoughtful. "You know, people assume independence means doing everything yourself." Caleb glanced at her wheelchair. "And it doesn't." "No, that's isolation." The answer settled between them. Maren continued. "Independence means I decide what help I accept, who I trust, what risks belong to me." Caleb looked through the terminal window at the airplane sitting quietly beneath the ramp lights. For years, he had measured being a good father by how many bad outcomes he could prevent. But Lucy was growing up. Sooner or later, protecting her would have to include teaching her how to make decisions when he wasn't there. His phone buzzed. A message from Rachel. "Lucy is celebrating like she got into Harvard. Whatever you said, she needed it." Caleb smiled. Maren noticed. "Good news. Apparently I've created a monster. 11-year-old girl. Terrifying." The accessible van pulled up outside. Maren put her coat back on. Caleb opened the terminal door, but he didn't reach for her chair. She rolled beside him on her own. At the van, she stopped. "You know what I expected when you volunteered to fly me?" "What?" "A man who needed to prove he was braver than everyone who said no." "And?" Maren looked back toward the airplane. "You were the only pilot today willing to turn away from the runway." Caleb considered that. Then he nodded toward her. "And you were the passenger who found the airport." Different checklists. Different checklists. The van driver secured the ramp. Before boarding, Maren looked at Caleb. "Tomorrow won't happen the way I planned." "Sorry. I'm not." She smiled slightly. "Turns out changing the plan isn't the same thing as losing control." Caleb watched the van pull away into the cold October rain. Only then did he realize the same sentence could have been meant for him. 3 weeks later, Caleb stood beside a trailhead in the Green Mountains with a thermos of coffee warming his hands. The first snow of the season had dusted the higher ridges overnight. Lucy wore a red insulated jacket, hiking boots, and a backpack that looked almost too large for her narrow shoulders. She had checked her gear twice. Caleb had checked it 4 times. "Dad, what? You're doing the face." "What face?" "The one where you're pretending you're not worried." "I'm not pretending." Lucy stared at him. "Okay, I'm pretending a little." She smiled. The school bus waited nearby, while teachers called names and parents gave last-minute instructions. Caleb wanted to give Lucy 10 more. Instead, he handed her the water bottle she had left on the hood of his truck. You know the plan? Yes. If the weather changes, listen to the guides. If you get separated, stay where I am and use the whistle. Lucy hugged him. That stopped the checklist. I'll be okay, Dad. Caleb held her tightly. I know. This time, he meant something different by it. He didn't mean nothing bad could happen. He meant he trusted her preparation, the adults responsible for her, and the person she was becoming. When the bus finally pulled away, Caleb stood in the cold until its taillights disappeared around the bend. His phone buzzed. A message from Maren. The demonstration had succeeded. Her engineering team had led it without her standing or sitting in the center of every decision. More importantly, she had begun reviewing accessibility procedures across several facilities her company regularly used, this time with employees who actually depended on those systems involved from the beginning. She ended the message with 2 words, different checklists. Caleb laughed. He replied, same lesson. He had not become Maren's personal pilot. She had not handed him a huge check, offered him an executive position, or magically solved his life. That wasn't what the flight had changed. Caleb had returned to his regular job and his ordinary responsibilities. He still packed Lucy's lunches. He still worried too much. He still woke some nights remembering the phone call that had told him his wife was gone. But he had started flying occasionally again, not because someone rescued him, but because he finally understood that being a father did not require erasing every part of himself that existed before tragedy. Maren changed too. She remained demanding, ambitious, impatient, and very much in charge of her company. But she stopped treating adaptation as surrender, and Caleb stopped treating fear as proof of responsibility. From the outside, people might have seen an unlikely pair, a powerful CEO in a wheelchair and a single father whose life looked modest beside hers. That would have missed the point. Money can change what choices are available to a person. Status can open doors. Poverty can make ordinary problems brutally difficult. Those realities matter, but none of them determine a human being's worth. A person with little money is not less deserving of respect. A wealthy person is not automatically cold or selfish. Someone using a wheelchair is not helpless. A working father is not insignificant because his name never appears on an office door. Human dignity should never depend on income, title, appearance, physical ability, or social position. What mattered between Caleb and Maren was that, eventually, they learned to see each other without those shortcuts. One knew the sky. The other knew barriers he had never noticed. Neither had every answer. Together, for one difficult flight, they had enough. And perhaps that was the lesson Caleb carried longest. Respect is not looking down at someone and deciding to save them. It is standing beside them, listening carefully, and recognizing that their life has the same human value as your own.